Well, let's make a start. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are. My name is Richard Feacham, and on behalf of the Pandemic Response Initiative of the Institute for Global Health Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this discussion on COVID-19 therapeutics, particularly biotherapeutics, more particularly monoclonal antibodies, and with special reference to Africa. There are roughly 270 people joining us today for this discussion, so a warm welcome to all of you from all around the world. Thank you so much for joining us. To fight COVID-19 and the next pandemic, which will surely come, and indeed to fight the great endemics, such as HIV, TB, and malaria, we need, of course, diagnostics, we need drugs, and we need vaccines. And over the past 10 months, in relation to COVID-19, I think you will agree that we have made good progress with the development of diagnostics. We have made spectacular, historic progress with the development of vaccines. But we've made only limited, and I think disappointing progress with the development of drugs. And this matters, this really matters. The COVID pandemic has a long way to run, and it will be several years before we achieve high immunization coverage worldwide. So we urgently need to accelerate drug discovery and development for COVID-19. We need drugs for prophylaxis. We need drugs for the treatment of early and mild disease in the community. And of course, we need drugs for the treatment of severely ill patients in hospital to prevent them from dying. But also, we must ensure that these drugs are both available and useful, not only for wealthy people in wealthy places, but for all people everywhere. No country is safe until all countries are safe, and equity is both a moral and an epidemiological imperative. So, are monoclonal antibodies potentially a part of the solution to this challenge? To shed light on this, and with the help of our very impressive panel, I pass you to my colleague, our moderator today, Dr. Kelly Sanders. Kelly, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you everyone for being here today. I'm Dr. Kelly Sanders, the technical lead of the UCSF Pandemic Response Initiative and a practicing physician. As a global health community, our charge is clear. Change the course of the pandemic to save lives and mitigate its unprecedented impact on humanity. Hundreds of repurposed and novel therapeutics are in trials, including monoclonal antibodies, new antivirals, and protein therapeutics like DARPins. Yet drug development for viral respiratory disease is notoriously difficult. And to date, we only have dexamethasone for critically ill patients, mixed data on remdesivir, and early positive data on monoclonal antibodies. Monoclonal antibodies have been in use for decades for treatment of many diseases. These drugs are biologic agents that mimic natural antibodies, and for COVID, bind to the spike protein to prevent infection. Eli Lilly and Regeneron's intravenous candidates have the most evidence to date and were recently given US emergency use authorization. Evidence shows these drugs decrease hospitalizations and medical visits, as well as viral loads, but are only effective for outpatients in the early stages of the disease and work best in high-risk patients with poor native antibody response. Due to their formulation and need for early administration, sorting out which patients should receive them and where they can safely do so presents many clinical and logistical challenges. With the addition of monoclonal antibodies to multiple large ongoing trials, we will have additional efficacy data in upcoming months to help guide best practices. The Gates Foundation and the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, led by the Wellcome Trust and Unitaid, are moving mountains to ensure these drugs are available to LMICs if proven effective. While promising, delivering and utilizing monoclonal antibodies in these settings will be undoubtedly difficult and complex. It is critical that we begin to plan now for the challenges ahead to ensure equity for patients in Africa. And working on these issues for COVID-19 could be transformative for other disease applications and also for future pandemics. Today, we have an incredible group of innovative and committed experts who will share their insights. Knowing the amazing demands on their time, I want to extend my gratitude for their participation. We hope that our time together today will serve as a spark point for further discussion and collaboration amongst those present to help find creative solutions to the challenges ahead with optimism and urgency. I would now like to introduce each of our participants. We will start with brief presentations, followed by a view from Ghana, and then the panel discussion. Of note, longer biographies are in the link in the Q&A box. First, Dr. Bernice Don is the Vice President for Health Sciences at the University of Liberia and former Minister of Health for the Republic of Liberia. Sir Jeremy Farah is Director of the Wellcome Trust, which is co-chair of the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator. Dr. Prashant Yadav is a global supply chain expert and is currently a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development and a professor at INSET. Dr. Dean Pettit is the Senior Vice President of Biotherapeutic Sciences at Just Evotech Biologics, where he leads the development of platform technologies. Dr. Fatima Suleiman is the Chair of the South African Pricing Committee and Director of the World Health Organization's Expert Advisory Panel on Drug Evaluation. Dr. George Chey, our discussant, is a Senior Research Fellow at the Noguchi Memorial Institute for Medical Research, an infectious disease doctor at Washington University and the University of Ghana. Our special guest, Dr. Raji Tajuddin, is Acting Head of Public Health Institutes and Research at the Africa Centers for Disease Control and will kick off our panel discussion. And finally, Dr. Trevor Mundell, the President of the Global Health Division at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, joins us to provide closing remarks. Please do send questions through the Q&A box for the panel discussion. I'd now like to invite Dr. Bernice Don to kick off our conversation. Dr. Don, please turn on your video and start us off.
Okay, thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody, depending on where you are. Since the COVID-19 outbreak, as of yesterday, Africa has registered about 2.3 million, a little above 2.3 million cases. There has been a little over 54,000 deaths, and there has been a little over 1.9 million recoveries. There have been a slight increase in the number of cases since late September. The Africa CDC and WHO puts it at 7.5% weekly. And there is a lot of variations across the continent. COVID-19, like the West Africa Ebola outbreak, is unprecedented. And the scale of the pandemic has prompted the use of experimental drugs, like it happened during the Ebola outbreak. Now, the use of drugs, unlike the Ebola COVID-19 is global compared to Ebola that was restricted to the West African region and mainly in 3 of the West African countries. COVID-19 is global. And because of the nature of the disease, there has been a very big push to produce vaccines and drugs to curtail the disease. Having the drugs and the vaccines is not all to it, especially when it comes to us in low and middle income countries. We have to consider challenges that are ahead when it comes to distribution and administration of the commodity. So considering monoclonal antibodies is similar to the ZMapp that we administered during the ZMapp is also a monoclonal antibody. We administered ZMapp during the Ebola outbreak. As countries, we have to consider if the drug need cold chain logistics. Will the cold chain logistics that are available in country, for example, for routine immunization, be adequate, or is it appropriate for the drug? You skipped the slide, you need to go back. Will it be appropriate for the drug? Is there enough equipment in country? You also have to consider how the drug will be administered. Since it's a new drug, health workers need to be trained. You have to build the infrastructure to administer the drug. The infrastructure might not be a physical building, but it might be a system. If it is a commodity that needs to be kept at a certain temperature, when it enters the country, how is it kept? How does it move from the central warehouse to maybe a hospital that is in a remote area? You also have to consider the availability of supportive treatment. Will there be a need for oxygen respirators? You also have to consider equity in the distribution of the commodity. Next slide. We need the community education is key, especially with the way in recent times there is a lot of misconception, mistrust on new commodities, especially with vaccines especially. This is not a vaccine, but that is ringing bell in people's ears. And so the community need to be educated well on the drug. The drug exists, the pros and cons of the drug. The efficacy and the side effects, how the drug works, should be very clear and transparent, and community members need to understand it for us to be able to manage their expectations. What are some of the side effects they need to be looking for, and who they can contact if there's a side effect, for example. We need to address confidence issues. We also have to, countries normally will weigh the costs and the impact. Their costs at different levels when it comes to administering drugs. So take for instance, since it's a new drug, health workers need to be trained. If the drug had to be procured by the government, then there's a cost attached to it. If it has to be maintained at a certain temperature, there's also a cost attached to it. So governments will think about the costs, the cost implication. They will be weighing the benefits against the impact of the drugs, and then they will be weighing the trade-offs. Take for instance, if they have to spend $3,000 on one commodity for a COVID patient, and they are few as compared to the number of children that will need measles vaccines, for example, they will think on what to let go and what to spend their money on. When we were administering the ZMapp was donated to the country. At the time, the number of cases were going down, and so we also did not need it. We did not use it in very large quantity. It is good to remember that we'll always have outbreaks, and so we should, as we build infrastructure, we should build infrastructure that can be used in the future for pandemic preparedness. Next slide. The infrastructure that was built during the COVID response benefited Liberia, especially for the COVID outbreak. So systems like the IMS Incident Management System, Emergency Operations Center were activated readily. So we were able to put in place active case finding, active case search, contact tracing. The whole surveillance system was in place. So as we build systems, we should consider systems that we can always build on or use during another outbreak. As I said earlier, we cannot overemphasize community and community engagement for new therapeutics and vaccines. We need to learn from the previous studies and manage risk perception for COVID virus and COVID risk perception. So communities need to understand the drug, they need to know the side effects, they need to know what to expect, and governments need to know that, because the government will have to accept that they will have to administer the drugs. Next slide. Yes, governments need to know that they have to administer the drugs, and for them to accept, they need to understand the drugs well, because normally there's a lot of apprehension. And there will be people who will be asking, if something should happen to a patient, what will happen? Who will be responsible? So adverse effect should be considered, and what systems will be in place to address adverse effects should also be considered and planned for early. Who will be responsible? Who will be the one to communicate the information? What actions need to take place? All those need to be readily planned for whilst introducing the commodity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dawn, for providing your insights on delivery challenges and experience with Ebola planning. We will now hear from Dr. Prashant Yadav. Dr. Yadav, please join us.
Hi, thanks. Thanks, Kelly. I will keep my remarks focused on things related to the supply chain for monoclonal antibodies, and monoclonal antibodies in particular for COVID-19. I think I want to start by saying that one of the key barriers to access to monoclonal antibodies, not just for COVID-19, but more widely, has been their cost of production. So not so much just the price, but the sheer cost of making them tends to be quite high. But the good news here is that through a set of investments by industry and companies themselves, both large generic companies and innovative pharmaceutical companies who've been doing process intensification exercises, looking at alternative ways of synthesis, those costs are coming down. They have not come down to a level where we are all super excited and ready to say, yes, this is something that can become widely affordable, but they are coming down. The directional trend is very optimistic. And on top of that, our efforts that many of the private philanthropic groups are doing to further accelerate that, such as the work that their colleagues who focus on chemistry, manufacturing, controls at the Gates Foundation are doing, or some work that the Wellcome Trust has done. So cost in general is coming down. The other exciting trend, in my opinion, is when we are talking about monoclonal antibodies for COVID-19, we also see some exciting developments in these smaller size monoclonal antibodies. And the reason it's important to flag that is that the supply chain, the delivery challenges that we see with the larger monoclonals are much more easier to manage and handle, such as temperature stability, other things, delivery mechanism for these smaller antibodies. And if the clinical trials do show that these newer types of fragmented or nano ones are effective, then we will have a very promising future for the use of monoclonal antibodies at price points and using manufacturing techniques that are widely accessible, including for Africa. They are also products which lend themselves very nicely for decentralized manufacturing. And this is where there is slight divergence in opinion. Some people will say the large facilities that have been set up by WuXi or the Serum Institute or some other groups is where we will achieve the lowest costs of manufacturing, and therefore that's where the future manufacturing centers should be located. The other view of the world is, and I sort of agree with the second view, is that the new technology, especially the single-use reactors and other things that have been used more extensively for monoclonal antibodies, are going to allow us to do much more decentralized manufacturing. So lots of regions can make their own monoclonal antibodies, and that would mean Africa as a continent would have to think about, within the larger pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for Africa, which the African Union and the African Union's Development Agency had laid out, where do they fit monoclonal antibodies as an option for COVID-19 within that, which can be something that can be accelerated faster than the rest of the AU MPA plan is done. And secondly, what would be the larger use of monoclonal antibodies within this plan? So not just for COVID-19, but for other uses, including for non-communicable diseases and also for other pathogens and infectious diseases. So that's on manufacturing. Lots of exciting developments. The top of the supply chain starts with having enough capacity. If we have enough capacity, then we worry about the remaining downstream things. The second part I want to stress is a regulatory pathway and financing. So I think we very often jump to ideas such as, do we have the cold chain for monoclonal antibodies? In my opinion, yes, they are constraints, but they are not our biggest constraints. They are workable, they are surmountable. Where the bigger barriers lies are in regulatory pathways in the supply chain. And whether we think about a global WHO pre-qualification driven regulatory pathway or national regulators, and in the case of Africa, the exciting development with the Africa Medicines Agency, that once again needs to look at this as a special category and figure out how can we ensure that if the trials show that monoclonal antibodies are indeed effective, including the newer ones, the smaller ones that I'm describing, then there is an accelerated pathway. And that could become sort of the first thing that the AMA charter does soon, whenever it can work. And now, again, as you see, I'm very optimistic about some of these things. The last thing that is not at the country level, but still in the global domain for supply chains is related to financing and demand forecasting and predictability of demand to manufacturers, wherever the manufacturer is located. So it could be an innovative monoclonal antibody manufacturer, it could be a generic company, or it could be a new, more decentralized Africa-based manufacturer. Everybody will require a firm demand forecast. This is a product where you need it even more so than you would need it for small molecule manufacturing, oral solids, and other things. And we don't have clarity on how much would be needed. And that's where, once again, I think the positive development here is that Africa CDC and the AU Supplies Management Platform at least can become the vehicle for solving some of these problems. And then once you get into the country, there are lots of little supply chain issues which are tactical in some ways to the bigger problem. But if we make a concerted effort on saying this is truly a tool we want to invest in and fix, then we can figure out information systems that have been used for other products where we've started to make progress on understanding stock, flow, use, consumption, how much to send where do we have the capacity, if it is for prophylactic use versus it is for in facility use, what will be the supply chain looking like? Those planning tools are things that we have. We have developed those tools over many years of work. And I think working with Africa CDC, the African Medicine Supply Platform, and the African Union Development Agency, we have a unique opportunity to create access for monoclonal antibodies in Africa faster than perhaps we are even doing in the industrialized world. So that's, to me, an opportunity waiting for all of us to come together and do something about it. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Dr. Yadav, for your interesting insights on the supply chain and recent advances as well. We would now like to ask Sir Jeremy Farah to please come on screen for our next presentation.
Great. Can you, I hope you can hear me. It's been a bit disrupted at this end today.
All great, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, I'm sorry, thanks very much for the introduction, and it is great to join you all of what I think is actually a hugely important topic. Of course, we hope it's going to be important in COVID, but actually I see through sort of dark days of 2020 and COVID itself, and particularly all thoughts with everybody in the United States, North America at the moment, because obviously you're going through a very, very difficult time with COVID, as Europe still is, but I hope Europe is coming out of the worst of this current wave. And it's great to have just followed Prashant Yadav, because I think many of my comments will build off what he said. Firstly, over the last 20 years, really, as everybody would know, the monoclonal antibodies have been one of the most exciting areas of development for therapeutics across a whole range of clinical indications, from cancer therapy, of course, to autoimmune disease, to infections themselves, and many others. And yet, actually, during that time, and it's been quite a long time that those have been developing now, it's been extraordinarily difficult to make the transition to a more equitably accessible set of therapies globally. The use of monoclonal antibodies in cancer therapy and other indications has largely been concentrated in the developed world, in the rich world, and it has been quite difficult to ensure that those remarkable treatments, which have really transformed some of those areas of medicine, are available more accessibly because of many of the reasons we've just heard of from Prashant, about supply chains, about manufacturing technologies, about price, and of course provision and cold chains and many others. And as we come to the end of 2020 and we start to see the end of the tunnel of COVID and the phenomenal scientific advances that have gone on, I think we'll look back on 2020 with firstly horror of what happened globally, but we will also look back and think that maybe it was the year when we made advances that might have taken 5 or 10 years, but have been made within 12 months, whether it be on vaccine development or indeed, as we're discussing today, on the monoclonals. And the monoclonals in infectious diseases has had a checkered history, but I think again in the last 2 or 3 years we've seen real progress. And the therapeutics for Ebola, made from a variety of different companies and academic groups, from Democratic Republic of Congo through to companies in Europe and North America, I think, and the wonderful therapeutic study of Ebola demonstrating in what is a truly horrendous disease with a very, very high mortality, that monoclonal antibodies could reduce the fatality rate of patients with Ebola, I think will come to be seen as something of a landmark. And here in COVID in 2020, we're starting to see early data to suggest that particularly when you use these therapies early, they can limit the number of people that need to go to hospital and can save lives for those who are already in hospital. So I think 2020 will mark that point where monoclonal antibodies for infectious diseases started to become a route. And what we need to do, and this is why it builds so beautifully off the last talk, is make sure that we do progress the science of that for a series of different indications in infectious diseases and others, but also that we make sure that we make these remarkable therapies available in the most equitable and accessible way globally. And that means making use of some of the technological advances that will have happened in 2020, manufacturing techniques, yields from cell lines, and indeed making those monoclonals available and accessible in jurisdictions which have so far not had access to them. Picking up on the point about manufacturing and R&D, it's not just about the research and development of these antibodies and their manufacturing. It is also about the clinical trials that need to be conducted in order to do them, and conducted in countries all around the world, not just in the rich world, but making sure we actually conduct those clinical trials in an equitable way, and that we learn whether these monoclonals can treat patients in all countries rather than just some countries. And secondly, that the regulatory pathway for their approval is streamlined as far as possible, because many regulators around the world do not have such experience with the regulatory pathways for monoclonal antibodies. And here I'd pay tribute to the Gates Foundation work, for instance, on working with a number of regulators in sub-Saharan Africa to ensure that there is regulatory harmonization wherever possible, and where the regulatory agencies have got the skills, experience, expertise to be able to review these therapies and make sure they can be made available to patients in the shortest possible time. I also think that the other technologies that have progressed in 2020, for instance, we've all watched in awe as the RNA technologies for vaccine development have become mainstream, and indeed vaccine programs are now starting with those vaccines from both the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine and also the one from Moderna. That's to be enormously celebrated, and congratulated those organizations working on that. But I think there will be coming a sort of blurring of the margins in the future between traditional vaccines and therapeutics, and that we will see technologies being developed on the vaccine side which could have big implications for the development of therapeutics. And I think in future, 5-10 years from now, we may well look at vaccines and therapeutics in a different way, see more of an overlap there, where we may use these RNA technologies both to vaccinate people in a traditional way, but also use them to produce antibodies by the body itself, so that people can get prevention or indeed treatment using that sort of technology. So 2020 has been a horrendous year for everybody, and I don't want to underestimate that at all. But I also think in history, we may look back on it and think we made tremendous scientific advances, and we committed to those advances being equitably accessible to everybody on Earth who needs them. Kelly, I'll hand back to you if that's okay, and look forward to listening to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Sir Jeremy. I think your commentary dovetails quite nicely with our next presenter, which is Dr. Dean Pettit. If you could please join us to talk about some of the technological aspects of monoclonal antibodies.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, thank you. I am going to give you a short course in biotherapeutic development in 7 minutes, so hold on. And I'm the token industry representative here, and I hope that my experience can provide some value. Let's go to the next slide, and the next slide. As a problem statement, I don't think a whole lot needs to be said about COVID, and the numbers are staggering. And even I created this slide a week ago, and the numbers are much greater, as you all know. And the cost, the total cases, total deaths, and the total economic fallout is tremendous. And from a drug development perspective, these are daunting numbers for us, as been suggested by the other panelists. The industry is not yet prepared to respond, but this is an opportunity for us to learn as much as we can and improve. Let's go to the next slide. When you think about the cost of antibody development, there's really 3 areas that come to mind that need to be addressed. One is the cost of development. The discovery timeline adds to the cost tremendously, and typically the discovery timeline for antibodies is about a year. There have been some recent advances, and some of the COVID therapeutics have been discovered on a timeline that's less than a month. So there's been quite a bit of progress there. The development timeline for antibodies is quite prolonged. We've seen some advances from Regeneron, AstraZeneca, and some of the others. but still from a pandemic perspective, these are way too slow. And then product development failures is part of cost of development too, and I'll talk a little bit about that on a subsequent slide. There's also cost of goods, and oftentimes we get caught up in cost of goods and what those numbers are, but they're relatively immovable, I would say. We've reached a plateau in cost of goods. There's probably some things that we can do. There's still some low-hanging fruit, but there's not a lot we can do around improving cost of goods as a result of productivity improvements, labor and raw materials. Some of these things have reached a sort of a baseline. And then manufacturing facility utilization contributes to cost of goods. And perhaps we'll get into this in the discussion a bit, but large scale facilities can deliver the lowest cost from a cost of goods perspective, but these facilities need to be fully utilized to realize their low cost. And then there's cost of delivery, and oftentimes we don't think about this, but even vials and excipients can be expensive, add quite a bit of cost. Protein stability issues relate to the cost of delivery if we need to set up freezers and refrigerators in our systems. Elimination half-lives of antibodies are quite good as therapeutics, but if they were better, we could dose less frequently and reduce costs. And also the potency and the dose required for therapeutics can add to the cost. And if we can improve potency, reduce the dose, we can have an impact on the cost there as well. Let's go to the next slide. I think many of you probably are aware there's a Tufts analysis that happens every other year about the cost of therapeutics. And I think in the last round that was done, the estimate of the cost is about $2.6 billion for the development of a new therapeutic. Most of those costs for a single therapeutic come at the end in the clinical trials, but I just want to remind everybody that because of the number of failures, a less than 10% success rate on new therapeutics that are being developed, most of the costs overall, about 3/4 of the costs overall, because of the number of failures, come from that period between discovery and clinical proof of concept. So that's an area where we need to do a lot of improving around getting smarter about discovery, doing that faster, having better predictive models, better assays, and so forth. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit also about cost of goods. I mentioned there's not a ton that can be done here, and I'm going to share some of the numbers with you. This is a process economic model on the left, which breaks down the cost into the capital costs, materials, consumables, labor, and other costs. And you can see that a lot of the costs related to what's called cost of goods are around materials and consumables. There's a bit less on labor. There's some on capital as well, but these are the areas with the lowest hanging fruit that we can go after. You can see one of the consumables there is bags. These disposable bags are quite expensive because we're early in the industry and we can probably have an effect there, but it's not an enormous effect on the overall cost of these therapeutics. The panel on the right is how the process is run. We can get a lot of cost of goods manufactured savings by improving volumetric productivity, and that's grams per liter per day from a biologic system. And once we get above about 3 to 4 grams per liter per day, this curve levels out, and there's not a lot of additional cost of goods savings that can be realized from those increases in productivity. And as an industry, we are at about that level, 3 to 4 to 5 grams per liter per day. The other thing is the format in the operation. It's the culture duration you see there. As we get into formats with longer culture duration, there's also an opportunity to lower the cost there as well. Let's go to the next slide. And then on delivery, you know, I just want to say, I think it's pretty obvious the site that we're delivering these therapeutics to is going to make a huge difference in what kind of technology is available to us. There are two different strategies around stabilization. One is to use excipients to look at formulations that are most desirable, and they can have a big effect when we choose different additives. They can have a big effect on storage conditions. Probably something that has a bigger effect is optimization of the therapeutics that we're using and actually choosing sequences that can have good stabilization. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But when you think about drug discovery in general for antibodies, your immune system has no selective pressure on generating antibodies that can be stored at room temperature. It just doesn't exist. So we need to make more progress on actively engineering sequences that can withstand higher storage temperature and transfer conditions. Let's go to the next slide. And this is the last slide for me, just thinking about this from a high-level perspective. What we've done at my company is to think about this in an integrated way where the discovery of the molecule has a big impact on the process and how it runs, and the process has a big impact on the format of the operation that needs to occur. So as we can do these in a non-siloed way, we can start to have a greater impact on the cost. And I would say, as an industry, I've been in the industry for almost 30 years now, and as an industry, we've probably improved productivity from the early days by 2 to 3 orders of magnitude. And what we need here is one more order of magnitude of cost reduction to really have a significant impact on the accessibility of antibodies. And that order of magnitude will come from a contribution of all these areas: discovery, engineering molecule sequence, developing intensified processes, and low-cost manufacturing solutions. So there's no area that's too small to ignore, because we need to extract another order of magnitude off of the cost of the entire delivery process. So I'll end there, and yeah, thank you for the time.
Thank you, Dr. Pettit, for your insights on research and development, and we'll look forward to probably having questions about that in the panel discussion. Now I'd like to ask our final panelist, Dr. Fatima Suleiman, to please join us on screen for her presentation.
Hi everyone, good evening. I am going to shut my video down because there is some internet instability at the moment, so it'll probably be easier if I talk without the video on, but thank you all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who are present. Thank you for UCSF Institute of Global Health Sciences for the invitation to participate in this webinar today. I will be looking at access considerations from a country perspective. I will start with the slide that shows the COVID cases in South Africa up until the 6th of December. It's not as bad as the US, but we are the worst affected in Africa. And the statistics as from last night were that we were over 6,000 cases in the country, which is halfway to our peak in the first wave. And therefore, this is a critical point at which to start having this discussion, as vaccines will form one part of the solution, but not the entire solution. The next slide will deal with the first issues in relation to issues that need to be considered prior to the start of any program in a country. And it talks about regulatory issues that other participants have mentioned today. The monoclonal antibody might not be registered in the country, or it may be registered for another indication. And to fast track access, certain regulatory options, or maybe even loopholes, might need to be considered. All countries seem to have a registration option for patient access programs or for medications to be used in clinical trials. And this could be a possibility, even though it's very paper intensive. And while these may ensure immediate access for use, parallel process for registration need to be considered to ensure that once a program ends or a trial ends, these products are available in that country and their sustainability of supply. One additional issue that would need to be considered before a program begins is the clinical guidance strategy. Where in the system will these medicines be administered? By which specialization? For which patients? These can be worked on in conjunction with committees that exist in health system structures in countries, like a National Essential Medicines List committee. And complexity of the administration would also play a role as to where in the system they can be administered, and then subsequent costs to the system and patients to access these medications. The next slide would deal with once a program is initiated, what needs to be considered. And there are issues that need to be considered from a system perspective. In countries where these medications are used for other indications, there needs to be consideration that stock is available for these patients and that supply is not diverted at any stage, causing distress or anxiety to patients. And I talk from experience of previous medications that have been indicated have beneficial effects in COVID-19, but have later been proved to not have any effect. So there tends to be a system put in place that is vertical from the entire system. The financing is separate, the supply system is separate, but before a trial or a program needs to end, there has to be that integration into a country's system for sustainability of use thereafter as well. Communication needs to be clear at the very beginning and maintained throughout the program. Physicians and patients need to be aware on how to access the program. And the pharmacy and therapeutics committees can provide oversight on use in the system, as well as reporting of adverse events that was mentioned earlier. In a two-tiered healthcare system, communication needs to be clear about whether these products will be available equitably to both sectors, or if patients are to access these via the public sector only. If a private sector is due to be incorporated into the program, then there will also have to be stakeholders from the private sector that need to be included at the discussions in the beginning, including their formulary committees. My final slide talks about future considerations that's been touched on by different people in this panel. Monoclonal antibodies are expensive. There already exists a gap between high income and low and middle income countries in terms of use of these products, as these are high cost items. This program can serve as a mechanism for countries to begin to consider negotiating prices of these medicines once the trial or donation is coming to an end. These strategies may require countries collaborating with each other to negotiate lower prices based on combined volume arrangements. In Africa, that could be a target for the African Harmonization Initiative as well, because there are initiatives in Europe like Benelux that tend to do these, as well as forecasting for their volume requirements. In addition, globally, there's a conversation about what is a fair price, how transparency should feature into the setting of a product's price, and how investments from public funding into the development of the product need to be declared. These points I highlighted here for all of us to be aware that while this conversation may deal with one disease area, there are other monoclonal antibodies in the pipeline for HIV, for oncology, for other conditions. Whatever systems are developed by this trial or program needs to be sustained for the other technologies. Otherwise, we may end up widening the gap between high income and middle to low income countries. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Suleiman, and all of the panel presenters for your insights on the opportunities and the challenges associated with using monoclonal antibodies in LMICs and specifically Africa. I would now like to invite Dr. Che, our discussant, to provide some brief reflections on his thoughts about the panel presentations and how they might apply to Ghana. Dr. Che, over to you.
Thank you, Kelly. It's a pleasure to participate in this very important discussion. So it's really nice how the panel has touched on all of the very important issues let me just give a brief background of what is happening in Ghana, and then I'll touch on some of the issues that have just been discussed. So Ghana's government took a very aggressive posture to the pandemic, and it is pretty much under control, I would say, in this country at the moment. Currently, Ghana, a population of about 30 million people, have about, we've had about 53,000 cases overall. And as we speak, there have been a total of 326 deaths, and we have about 800 active cases, most of which are mild cases. Only about 15 people are currently listed as serious cases, and 4 people are in the ICU as we speak. But obviously it has had a devastating effect on the economy. Our economy was growing very rapidly, around 7 to 8% before, but this year is projected to grow at 0.9%. So you can imagine what that has done to the economy. In terms of the monoclonal antibodies, I'm really excited about it because, like I said earlier, I work in HIV on a regular basis, and especially HIV cure, where a lot of monoclonals are being developed. And the question has always been how to make sure that they are equitably distributed in Africa, where they are actually needed the most. So this COVID time should be a really good time for us to work out the kinks and work out the various modalities. One of the issues that have been touched upon by everyone is equity. And equity not only between the developed and developing countries, but also once it gets, let's say somebody pays for it and it gets into a country like Ghana, you know, and people know that, oh, maybe this thing works very well and maybe it's a blockbuster drug. You know, the question of it getting to those who need it rather than probably it going to those who have connections or who are politicians and so on and so forth is something that needs to be taken into really serious consideration because of systemic corruption and so on that exists in a lot of African countries. The other issue that has been talked on is the regulation. And a lot of African countries are getting stricter in terms of regulation. And the African Medicines Agency is a good way, and the harmonization that are being championed are a good way to overcome this issue. However, I think one of the important things that need to be done really is that during the clinical trials, Africa should feature prominently in these trials. As we all know, often what will happen is that, you know, a lot of the trials will be done in Europe and America, and maybe a little bit in South Africa, and that's about it. You know, and it's assumed that once a little bit has been done in South Africa, then it's okay for Africa. But I think that it should be spread more across the continent. As we all know, Africa has the largest, you know, gene diversity pool compared to even the whole of the rest of the world. So I will say that, you know, when these trials are being planned, we should consider South, East, North, and West Africa. And I think often it is assumed that maybe the capacity does not exist for these trials, but I think they do exist. And if we work a little harder, we'll be able to get, you know, some of these trials done. And once it is done in the environment, then the approval becomes easier, and also all of the questions that people have, you know, can also be answered because they know that their own people have participated in these trials. I had only 4 minutes, so I will end it here, and once we get into the discussion, maybe we'll talk more. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you so much, Dr. Che. Now I'd like to note that we are lucky to have Dr. Raji Tajuddin as a special guest from the Africa CDC, and he will help start the panel off with a brief comment and first question. I would like to now invite all of our panelists to please turn on their cameras and their microphones to join Dr. Tajuddin and myself for the panel discussion. Quick note, I understand and can tell we're running a little bit late, and we do have a hard stop for the panel, so I apologize. We will not be able to answer all of the audience's questions, but after the panel, we'll provide some written follow-up with other key thoughts and insights. Dr. Tajuddin, I'd like to turn over to you for a brief comment and the first question.
All right. Thank you so much, Kelly. First and foremost, let me appreciate the distinguished panelists. I've seen some known faces, some of which are my, one way or the other, my tutors or lecturers. I've seen Jeremy Farah there. So it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. And I bring you greetings from John Nkegasong, Director of Africa CDC, who have actually loved to be here. So let me start by saying that Africa recorded its first case of COVID-19 on the 14th of February this year. And a week after that, we were able to bring all the ministers of health from across the 55 member states together to endorse a continent-wide strategy on one hand, and also to endorse a task force that would drive the implementation of that strategy. Of course, this actually underscored the strength of what Africa CDC and African Union have been able to achieve in terms of a coordination, in terms of political support at the highest level, including the level of the head of state. And as part of our initiative, we focused a lot on case management, and that is purposefully so, because we know that we have a very weak health system, so we needed to find a way to build that capacity. So for Africa CDC, something like monoclonal antibody coming on board, on one hand, with a very weak health system on the other hand, and knowing fully well that this is an intervention that will prevent the mild to moderate cases from going into severe and critical form that will require some sort of sophisticated capacity that is not there in the first place. So it's a welcome development for us. There's no doubt about that. Now, in terms of what we need to do to make sure that we are part and parcel of this discussion, part and parcel of the monoclonal antibody agenda. A lot of colleagues have articulated what is needed to be done in terms of supply chain management, in terms of the different challenges that are there. So I just want to emphasize that some of these issues have been addressed partly through the COVID-19 vaccine development and access strategy that the continent has put together. That strategy is looking at three key areas. One is the aspect of clinical trial. In the past, most clinical trials have come from the Western world. So this time around, we said for the COVID-19 vaccine, we need to be part and parcel of that discussion as far as clinical trial is concerned. And so by extension, it's something that we can also deploy to support the monoclonal antibody. So what I'm saying here is that it's not enough to ship thousands of doses to Africa, but it's much more important for us to be part of that clinical trial, because we believe that this will allow for quick uptake of whatever product that is coming out there. It will allow for community acceptance of whatever that is coming. Number two on that vaccine strategy is access to sufficient doses of this COVID-19 vaccine, which by extension is how do we build our local manufacturing capacity? You know, again, that discussion fits perfectly well into the monoclonal antibody discussion. How do we also ensure that we are part of the production line as far as the monoclonal antibody is concerned? One colleague mentioned that thanks to technology, that the technology these days that is deployed to produce monoclonal antibody is something that is very easily transferable. So I think it would be nice and it would be good in the spirit of transfer of transfer of technology and building local capacity for Africa to be part of that. And one thing that the vaccine strategy has done is to map the different local manufacturing capacity on the continent. We have also mapped the different research institutes that is able to do clinical trial. So we are not starting from ground zero. So I think it's something that with just a little support and a little push, Africa can be part and parcel of this discussion. And the last but not the least on the vaccine pillar, which is also applicable to the monoclonal antibody, is the issue of regulation, issue of delivery, and issue of uptake. You know, there's been a lot of discussion. In fact, the technical working group in place that is looking at how do we harmonize the regulatory process on the continent, so that if South Africa or if WHO has pre-qualified a product, you know, how do we ensure that our member states do not go through the same exercise again, you know, leading to unnecessary waste of time? AMA is there, but we don't have enough member states that have signed on to that. So AMA, I think for now, is still medium to long-term project. So I think for now, the mechanism that has been put in place by the COVID-19 vaccine strategy can be leveraged upon to drive this monoclonal antibody discussion forward. So in terms of what the ask from this house, I think just from my discussion is, one, how do we ensure that our member states, the 55 member states, the 1.27 billion population, are part and parcel of the clinical trial as far as monoclonal antibody is concerned? That's one. Number two, how do we ensure that these 1.27 billion people do not rely on shipment of monoclonal antibody from US and from Europe? You know, how do we ensure that we complement that by making sure that there is a local capacity to manufacture some of these products? Then number three, how do we use the opportunity that has been afforded by this monoclonal antibody to be able to produce monoclonal antibody for some other diseases beyond COVID-19? For instance, Ebola, it has been proven to work, some other childhood viral illnesses, some cancers. So how do we use this opportunity to build the local capacity? You know, I don't think as Africans we are asking for too much. This is something that I think with the right coordination, with the right collaboration, and with the right support, I think we'll be able to Africa will be able to leverage on the opportunity provided by this COVID-19 to make sure that we position our continent in such a way that we have the needed capacity to be part and parcel of this monoclonal antibody discussion or agenda. So Kelly, let me stop there and wait for reflection and comment from other colleagues on this platform. Over.
Who would like
Kelly?
to kick off?
I'll jump in because I've got to step off, Kelly, I'm afraid. But actually, great to see you, and please send our best wishes to John when you get back. And for those who haven't worked directly with Africa CDC over the last year or two, I guess, a bit longer than that now, it really is transforming public health across the continent. And just pay absolute tribute to the leadership from the African Union and from the Africa CDC, because I think it's been a remarkable achievement, and congratulations on what you've done so far. But the point you make there about transfer of technology, about being engaged and involved in those clinical trials, in the very large number of clinical trials networks across the continent, just absolutely essential. The days of clinical trials being done in America, Europe, anywhere else in the world, and then just the products of that being then made available in other parts of the world, those days are over now. And we should all appreciate that. And the shifting of the center of gravity of the questions asked, the ability to support and build careers in all countries, I think, is what we need to build as we come out of COVID, and those institutions which are so important to that, the regulatory environment that we've heard about, the African Centre for Disease Control, the African Academy of Sciences, these are all institutions on which all of that enterprise can go on, and the innovation can happen, and the evidence base being developed. So I think that, again, as we look forward to 2021, is such a point of optimism.
Prashant, it looks like you might have some commentary there to add as well. Thank you.
No, I mean, firstly, I want to say similar note as Jeremy about Africa CDC and all the good work that John and Reggie and colleagues at Africa CDC are doing. I think one of the things that is important for the supply chain to function for a local manufacturer, and let's call them regional because local gives the idea that it's every country making its own monoclonal antibodies. For regional manufacturers, is that the purchasing platform across countries needs to be something that has low transaction costs. It's hard for a new manufacturer to work with every single procurement department in every country and try to sell their product. So the Africa CDC's umbrella Africa Supply Management Platform is a very welcome step because it helps buy on behalf of multiple countries in the region And if that's what we use for monoclonal antibodies, I think we can then really see the techno-economic feasibility of manufacturing on the continent increase dramatically. That also changes dynamics about forecasting, as I was describing before. It makes the possibility of creating more precise forecasts for that manufacturer. And then like Dean was mentioning, I think the comparison between one large facility versus more than one facility in a way depends upon not the volume that a facility is producing, but how predictable is that volume. So especially for batch manufacturing, knowing that this is how much you will need over the next time horizon, you can plan your batches better. And even with moderate sized facilities, you can be cost competitive to very large manufacturing sites. So I think that's where Africa CDC, the Africa Medical Supplies Platform, and some things related to regulatory harmonization, if they come together, then I think the rest of the things are tactical. We can work to solve them.
I agree.
I wanted to move into a couple of our audience questions.
Sorry, Kelly. Can I just add to that for a second? Sorry, I don't have my mic on, my video on because the internet is unstable, but I wanted to just bring in that there is the Medicines Patent Pool, which is a global organization that has been sort of assisting countries with technology transfer in terms of access to maybe essential medicines that are on the WHO list and so forth. And there are lessons that could be learned from them as well, because with technology transfer, there come some restrictions as to who can access that technology and where can those medicines then be subsequently sold by the companies providing that technology transfer. So inevitably, it's the lower income countries or the lower middle income countries that have access to that technology and the technology transfer. And sales cannot therefore be then to maybe upper middle income countries. Yet those are the ones that are also impacted by these high cost items. So I like the ideas that are floating, but I think we need to learn from lessons that are happening globally and talk about the fact that when there is this technology transfer, that maybe it shouldn't be according to income classifications that are used by the World Bank, but some other sorts of disease burden or access and affordability considerations that need to be considered as well.
So some follow-up questions also from the audience that we have here. And of course, to the panelists, please feel free to continue answering the additional questions that Dr. Tajuddin posed. But I did want to ensure that we had a few from the audience as well. And one question, Dr. Suleiman, that I think you might be able to help kick us off with is whether or not there's a plan to have post-approval surveillance programs in countries to track potential emergence of resistance to monoclonal antibodies and also potential loss of efficacy in any particular region over time. And Dr. Pettit, maybe after Dr. Suleiman, you can also feed into some of that as well.
So currently every country has in their infrastructure something that's called a pharmacovigilance unit or a pharmacovigilance unit, and Africa does have those in their countries across. In fact, there's even a WHO collaborating center on pharmacovigilance in Ghana, headed by Alex Dadu as well. So there are these structures in place. The problem though is that they're not robust enough in all of the countries, and part of what we need to do is develop these structures so that there's active reporting. There's a lot of passive reporting systems at the moment. Pharmaceutical companies are generally very good to work with prescribers and dispensers when it's clinical trial conditions to maintain these, but then they sort of ease off thereafter. Systems do pick them up. I mean, I know South Africa has a good system to pick up some of these, and they've seen these in the HIV medication or antiretroviral medication administration. But I think Africa as a whole, and CDC has been doing some really good work, but we do need to build more capacity in our pharmacovigilance systems post registration of the medicines and keep those active as well.
Yeah, I don't have much to add there. I will say, just picking up on another point, that a distributed manufacturing model, I think, really is the path forward. You know, in the history of our industry, we've had very centrally organized manufacturing solutions, and those have required a lot of investment. They're very significant investment for these manufacturing facilities. They're multi-billion-dollar manufacturing facilities. And they tend to be focused on blockbuster type drugs, and they're not necessarily regionally relevant. So we've been developing technologies, and these single-use system technologies have been quite a boon to this thinking about low-cost enabling of manufacturing globally. So I'm sorry, my perspective is a bit more technological, and I think that there's a lot we can solve through technology, and those are my only comments there.
Kelly, just very quickly as well, it's a very good question about resistance, because we've got to remember that most of the natural immunity after infection and from vaccines, and indeed monoclonals, are all targeting the same protein. So that makes that spike protein very, very vulnerable to resistance when we have that massive immune pressure coming on. And the second one is part of post-marketing surveillance, pharmacovigilance, but also is the risk of fake drugs and fake vaccines. And this bedevils so many parts of the world, actually, but particularly in infectious diseases, malaria, HIV, tuberculosis. Fake drugs are a huge, a criminal activity of enormous scale, and anything we can do to address that is going to be hugely important.
Thank you so much for that comment, and one that hasn't come up yet, and obviously is going to be a huge problem as we move forward for all of these drugs, in addition to the vaccines, as you noted. I just want to pose one last question, Dr. Yadav, that is going towards you about one of the advantages of the centralized manufacturing model being a robust and proven QA/QC system that is already in place. And in the decentralized model of manufacturing, how would quality be ensured with many multiple smaller sites?
Yeah, I think very important and salient point we oftentimes think of as an afterthought when we're thinking about the economic case for distributed manufacturing. And I think the key thing here is that quality is, one is about quality assurance and quality within the walls of a manufacturing site, but then it's quality as regulated by the local or the national regulator, and then is issues related to data integrity and quality, right? So ensuring that there is a proper system of keeping track of every batch, and that data getting reported not just to the local regulator, but to a system which is created in the region. And that's what I think we look towards the leadership of Africa CDC, AUDA, AMA, or its smaller subunits at this point in time. But yes, it does create a slightly higher overhead in decentralized manufacturing. Because some of the larger manufacturers have set up these quality labs, which are working not just for one product line, but have huge economies of scope. Their QC lab is doing this for dozens and dozens of products, some of them being very high volume products. So in addition to innovating on the cost of monoclonal antibody manufacturing, a more general thing that we need to think about is how do we bring down the cost of doing quality testing? How do we create laboratories that are shared between manufacturers so that not everybody has to set up their QC lab from scratch? And then data integrity things, which once again are managed in the right manner.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yadav. What I'm noting here is that, in fact, we need many, many more of these conversations with experts like those of you who are here today. And I'm so grateful for your participation in really just starting this conversation. I think we are ending with many questions, and to the audience, I'd like to say thank you for submitting your questions, and we will work to answer those that we have been unable to answer over the last hour plus, and provide some follow-up in written form after the panel. I'd now like to move to our closing remarks by Dr. Trevor Mundell. And I just want to note one question that came up from our audience, which is, are we spending enough to prepare monoclonal antibodies for LMIC settings? And what more can the global health community do to invest? Which I believe you're planning to speak to anyways, but I think a really important point. And I'll ask the rest of our panel, or the rest of our panelists, to please turn off your videos so that we can hear our final remarks from Dr. Mundell. Thank you so much.
Kelly, thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation from Richard and yourself. Also want to thank the panelists for giving us a really comprehensive overview of some of the promise and also some of the detailed challenges in many different domains in terms of introducing monoclonal antibodies to lower middle income countries. We have been working on this problem for quite a number of years. It was mentioned already in the area of HIV, seasonal prophylaxis for malaria, certain infectious diseases, RSV is one of them. But I would say that the monoclonal antibody programs in those areas were moving according to the usual time frame, as Dean had mentioned, which can be many, many years in terms of the manufacturing and the development process. And then we come to the COVID situation, 2020, and the tragedy that is unfolding. And we go from the sequence of the virus to a clinical trial with GMP material in 3 months. And this just transforms what I think any of us ever thought would be feasible from a monoclonal antibodies. And now the question is, how do we address the equity considerations and make them broadly available? The Fuji capacity that was reserved will come online in Q2 of 2021 and should be able to produce between 2 and 4 million doses, which is exclusively reserved for lower middle income countries that will have a higher disease burden. It will be delivered through the ACT-A accelerator framework and the therapeutics work stream of that. And I do want to thank the other partners, Dr. Tajuddin from Africa CDC, for instance, that have been working on an algorithm for delivery when somebody turns up who may be a high-risk early stage patient. How would they be evaluated as a potential candidate for these antibodies? And then having had having the supply really then sets up all of the issues which have been put on the table in terms of the delivery challenges, the training of healthcare workers, the healthcare systems, and indeed even having that supply brings up the issue of the cost. And as much as there will be a lot of support for that, we understand that we still might not be at the price point that's going to make these widely available in all circumstances across the globe. So that's the prospect for next year. But thinking to the future, it really seems that with monoclonal antibodies, we are really almost there in making them a tremendously useful tool for people across the globe. We need to reduce the cost of goods, and in fact, the total cost by at least 1 order of magnitude. But we think that there are technical solutions that are being worked on right now for that. But then more importantly, to the points that folks have made around the clinical trial infrastructure, the regulatory systems that have never dealt with this type of therapeutic before, and then the healthcare systems themselves in terms of how will healthcare workers be trained, and will we have the types of formulations that will make these accessible, not just in big medical centers, but really free as well. I've just been tremendously encouraged by the public-private partnership and the sense of collaboration around this effort that we've seen over the last many months. So I am very optimistic that in the next couple of years, we are going to be surprised and positively surprised by how important monoclonal antibodies are going to be for the global health system. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Trevor, and a big thank you to all our panelists and discussants and to our moderator. It's been a fascinating 90 minutes with many insightful perspectives. I know I've learned a lot, and I'm sure many people listening in have done also. So a big thank you to our panelists and speakers. I want to also recognize the leadership role of some of our partner organizations, Unitaid and Wellcome Trust, IAVI, the Gates Foundation, and others. And I commend to you all an upcoming panel on global access pathways for monoclonal antibodies that is being organized on January the 19th, which will take this discussion forward and add to what we've covered here today. Our pandemic response initiative at UCSF will be writing up the key insights from today and sharing those with all of you. And we'd be delighted if you would also share those widely among your networks and collaborators. I have two particular takeaways from this discussion we've just had, which I'll briefly share. First, that we clearly have the ability to reimagine and to re-engineer monoclonal antibodies to make them easier and cheaper to manufacture, easier and cheaper to distribute, and easier and cheaper to administer. And we should pursue those opportunities very vigorously to move monoclonal antibodies from really a luxury good used in wealthy hospitals in wealthy countries to something that has broad applicability around the world and has a strong equity dimension. Secondly, it really struck me in the discussion that the rapid advances in monoclonal antibodies that we've been hearing about obviously have relevance well beyond COVID-19. They will help us in the fight against COVID-19, no doubt, but they have relevance well beyond that. They have relevance to preparedness for the next pandemic, which will surely come and could be much worse than COVID-19. They have relevance for other infections, as people have emphasized, I think myself of malaria, where we've been struggling for quite a while to come up with useful monoclonal antibodies. And they have relevance beyond infectious diseases in areas such as cancers, as a number of people have mentioned. And finally, to echo the sense of optimism that we heard from a number of speakers, on the one hand, 2020 has witnessed the greatest and most costly global disruption of our lifetimes. And it hasn't by any means finished yet. 2021 is going to be a very challenging year as well for many people and communities all around the world. But it has also, on the positive side, unleashed unprecedented innovation and energy, which, for example, has already revolutionized the field of vaccines and is poised, I think, to revolutionize therapeutics, including biotherapeutics and monoclonal antibodies. And of course, it is also pushing new frontiers in global collaboration, in sharing information and resources between the North and South, and ensuring that we really recognize that equity is not just a moral imperative, but is an epidemiological and public health imperative as well. So with those brief remarks, I'd like to say that we look forward to keeping in touch with everybody. Thank our panelists and moderator once again, and say farewell for the moment, and wish you all a pleasant day or evening, depending where you are in the world. So goodbye for now, and thank you very much.